announced and do not necessarily reflect the views of CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, CNN, or MSNBC, or Al Jazeera, or anyone else in the branch.
Hey, Stella! Hey, Stella!
And now, the host of our program, Scott Clark.
People hang on his every word.
It's the Heidelcast, the broadcast devoted to recovering Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
What are we talking about? We're talking about practice. Not a game, not a game, not a game. We're talking about practice.
I'm a pastor and a church historian. This is episode 93 for the week of Sunday, May 30, 2015. The Heidelcast is a service of heidelblog.net. Contact the Heidelcast at heidelblog.net or on Twitter at @RScottClark. Send us a message, and we may use it in a future broadcast. Catch all the episodes at heidelblog.net or subscribe in iTunes or another podcast app. Click on the Heidelcast icon on the HB homepage to get all of the information.
Guess what? I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
See, you asked for it, and we always provided week after week after week. Cowbell and other good things. We're interrupting our series on Of Nice and Men for a two-part mini-series, a conversation with Stella Morabito. And we're talking about freedom of speech in America. And this is not just a theoretical issue. It's real. It's a real problem, a real issue. You might not want to admit it to yourself, but consider this. How often, when you want to say something that you think or know might be controversial, do you close a door so that no one else can hear you say what you're about to say? Or do you whisper because you don't want someone else, other than the person with whom you're speaking, to hear what you're about to say? Why is that? Why do you feel that pressure? Why do you hold your tongue when you want to say something that you know to be perfectly reasonable and true, but you're afraid of the consequences? You do that because you know that we do not really have, in the United States of America anymore, free speech. We have, voluntarily in some respects, limited our speech. And again, I'm not talking about yelling fire in a crowded theater, although even that episode or even that example is somewhat misleading. Let's agree that it is wrong to say fire in a crowded theater. But Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said more about free speech than just you do not have a right to yell fire in a crowded theater. He said, for example, in 1919, in a dissenting opinion in Abrams versus the United States, persecution for the expression of opinions seems to me to be perfectly logical. If you have no doubt of your premises or your power and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally express your wishes in law, and you sweep away all opposition. To allow opposition by speech seems to indicate that you think the speech impotent, as when a man says he has squared the circle, or you do not care wholeheartedly for the result, or that you doubt either your power or your premises. But when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe even more than they believe the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. That, at any rate, is the theory of our Constitution. But that's not the theory on which many people are operating today. We are increasingly faced with official and unofficial pressure to conform our ideas to what is perceived to be, what has been created to seem to be, the majority view, even if that isn't exactly factually accurate. In other words, it's possible through social media to create the impression of a consensus when, in fact, that consensus doesn't actually exist. And there are a lot of words for describing this apparent consensus, and one of them is gaslighting, which is the procedure whereby we, others, are made to think that something is the case that isn't actually the case. And then we're encouraged to act according to this false perception. This goes on all the time. You can look it up for yourself. We also face, perhaps, at least, the possibility of official coercion of speech. Our guest today, Stella Morabito, has recently written, and I quote, "Laws intended to change how individuals think about anything require enforced silencing. If the, quote, freedom for all Americans, close quote, meme is about freedom, which it is not, then it is only about negative freedom. That is freedom from discrimination, freedom from, quote, hate, close quote, which basically gives carte blanche to those holding power, ultimately the state, to define and cherry pick whatever discrimination and hate may mean before granting whatever due process is left over for the accused. So, laws of this sort, hiding under the fig leaf of anti-discrimination, will give the state the power to police speech and behaviors. Coercive unity of the sort proposed by, and she lists people such as Singer and Gill and others, in their, quote, American unity, close quote, means a collectivist type of unity that is not voluntary, but enforced in law. The actual enforcement mechanism for anti-discrimination measures might still be up in the air, but likely involves the creation of a host of new, quoting again, human rights, close quote, commissions, basically hate tribunals, set up at the local, state, and federal levels. And this has already been done in Canada. And there's the end of the quote. This is from her article, LGBT Activists Arm for Further War Against Free Speech. In case you think this is mere theory, it's already happening on American university campuses everywhere. This is how American universities regularly adjudicate claims of sexual harassment and similar sorts of claims about hate speech. There's an entire organization, the acronym of which is FIRE. It's the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and the website is thefire.org, thefire.org. And they document these kinds of speech tribunals that exist and function regularly, even though courts have also just as regularly overturned them as unconstitutional. Nevertheless, they exist. They exist on state-funded university campuses, and they're conditioning university students to expect that this is how public life, civil life, and free speech are to be exercised, and the conditions under which they are to be exercised. We're talking this week with one of my favorite authors, Stella Morabito, about an article she published recently at Federalist.com. The article is LGBT Activists Arm for Further War Against Free Speech, and she published that on May 20th, 2015. She writes about society, culture, and education. She's widely published. You can read her work in The Federalist, The Washington Examiner, The American Thinker, and at StellaMorabito.net. That's one word, StellaMorabito.net. She's been an intelligence analyst studying aspects of Russian and Soviet politics, including communist media and propaganda. She's a parent, a former public school substitute teacher, and currently writing about political correctness and related issues. Hi, Stella, and welcome back to the Heidelcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for that nice introduction.
Well, let's define our terms. First of all, when you say free speech, what do you mean?
Well, the ability to think out loud, the right to think out loud, and not have to suffer unreasonable repercussions. To suffer consequences, of course, if you offend people. They have the right to think out loud as well. But that your livelihood, your honor, shouldn't be taken away from you for.
We live in a high-tech, highly connected world in which now everybody's saying everything that they think on social media, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and other platforms. And now we see these sort of mob actions. And as I keep mentioning to people, I was really struck by, and I guess affected by, a couple of cases on Twitter in which a woman thought out loud, tried, I think, to be politically correct in a way, made a joke about AIDS and Africa. And she got on a plane, and by the time she got off the plane in Africa, she had lost her job because of Twitter outrage. And there have been other cases like that where somebody on an airplane heard somebody say something they didn't like and turned around, took a photograph and wrote something, posted it on social media, and the person behind her was shamed in public on social media, and I think lost his job as well. So we live in a strange time where we've never had, more ability to express ourselves in public, and yet it seems like it hasn't been this dangerous to express ourselves in public for a very long time in this country.
It's interesting. There are a lot of ironies in that we have anybody can have a platform, and of course anybody can be shouted down from that platform. I think what the difference is, aside from the fact that the side that is doing most of the silencing is extremely organized, and certain agendas absolutely need that type of silencing in order to get any traction, and the folks who are pushing those kinds of agendas, and the LGBT lobby is just one of them. It just happens to be the most vocal. Have really seemed to make very good use of tactics and processes of social psychology that those who take free speech for granted are kind of clueless about. And so it's not really a level playing field in that respect. But I think I remember the cases that you were talking about, and it's a really kind of chilling effect that goes into effect. Where people are navigated literally by mob action, and these are mobilized mobs, and they are navigated into certain ways of thinking through the restriction and silencing of their opinions, and it creates that spiral of silence that I think we talked about in an earlier time, and the spiral of silence that creates that chilling effect that causes fewer and fewer people to speak out, so that the agenda item, I'm kind of walking through and rambling here, but the way certain agenda items like this that have a lot of clout behind them, a lot of elitist organized clout, will then create this kind of opinion cascade. And as public opinion appears to change, then the policies follow suit and public policy changes.
You described a couple of different dynamics, one of which is the organized versus the unorganized.
Right.
And that's important because one of the great questions that we need to think about as just American citizens with constitutional liberties, right, guaranteed to us in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights, is the potential loss of those liberties at the hands of small, well-funded, organized groups. And I'm not talking about conspiracies. I'm talking about people who are openly articulating their agenda and have achieved a remarkable degree of influence in our culture. Recently, for example, a study was published in which groups were asked, how large is the LGBT population in the United States?
Oh, yes. Yeah, this is hilarious.
And the real numbers are, if you're just asking about homosexuals, about 2%. But if you broaden the category out to LGBT, then it gets maybe as high as 4%. But when you ask millennials, they think 30% of the population is LGBT.
Right.
Which is remarkable, and it says a great deal about the way they perceive the world, and it also says something about how the LGBT organizations have gained such influence in our culture.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that was wild, that survey. And what was even crazier is how they tried to account for that, how the media itself that pushes the impression that, that it's 30, maybe even 40% of the population. I mean, you have the media, you have Hollywood, you have academia. They're all, they've been pushing these slogans and memes of the LGBT agenda for so long, and it just seems as though the reflection that any millennial would get, or any American really who isn't paying attention or doesn't read much, is that it's a huge portion of the population. And that's just all part of the saturation of political correctness. There's, it operates, I wrote a piece about this a while back, how political correctness, operates on two levels. It'll saturate the society with a slogan or a meme or, an agenda item that they're pushing. And at the same time, it will suppress any opposing response, or they will limit and control who actually they will allow to debate. That's another issue, but there's a lot of suppression through political correctness as well. And so through those dynamics, you end up with, an audience, a nation that's kind of detached from the reality and the facts, and because the facts are not something, those are getting repressed because they get in the way of the agenda. The agenda moves forward through the belief that this is like almost a majority.
One of the terms that we need to define, just in case the listener isn't absolutely sure, we've been using this acronym, LGBT, or these initials. What does that stand for, LGBT? And sometimes you'll see Q at the end.
Yeah, you can have a lot of fun with this because they've been adding a whole lot more. Well, L for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, T for transgender. But you never hear about the bisexual because I think that kind of gets in the way of the idea of you're born that way. You can't choose one or the other. But I like to joke that the B really stands for Borg. It's just a matter of absorbing everybody into this agenda. But and the T, the transgender piece of it, is now taking off. It's really was buried for years, but it's taking off because what it does is it has a lot of potential to turn the society upside down because the idea is to erase all sex distinctions in law. And in fact, this is a little aside, but this is really interesting. In Canada, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has just agreed to hear a lawsuit put forth by, I guess, I think there were 9 plaintiffs, to have all references to sex removed from all birth certificates. And, that's something that you heard a little bit of here. There was a Slate article last year about how it's unfair to children to force them with this identity. They call it gender. Really, we're talking about physical sex, but they call it gender assigned at birth, as though it's arbitrarily assigned. And so they use that argument to call for the end of all sex distinctions in law, which, of course, you get if your birth certificates no longer carry a reference to whether you're male or female. So it's pretty crazy Twilight Zone stuff because once sex distinctions are erased in law, which of course is the aim, And I believe that was the aim of the elites pushing the LGBT agenda for so long. It wasn't really about lesbians as gays as much as it's about the gender identity issue, because that redefines humanity for everybody. It's not just about a tiny demographic. It's about redefining everybody, erasing their sex, the fact that they are male or female, erasing that legally. And once that's erased legally, there's no longer, a legal mother or a legal father, or, you get into the whole realm of licensing parents and all this other stuff that's on the horizon. And there's no, as you said before, it's not really a conspiracy. I mean, they're out there, they're talking about it, they're bringing lawsuits. It's out there. The problem is when people can't connect the dots and see on the horizon where it's going to lead. And, a lot of our policymakers just seem clueless about that, or they don't want to go there.
Here I have to make a confession, because when some of this was first sort of mooted to me as, look, this is happening elsewhere, it could happen here, we need to pay attention. My first response was, well, this is the United States, and we have a constitution.
Right.
Unlike other places, we have a written constitution with written guarantees. And we have a tradition. We have a way of adjudicating these issues, and we've always had small anarchic groups in our history who've sought to overturn the constitutional order in one direction or another. Sometimes very large groups. People don't realize that the communist movement in the United States in the early 20th century was very large and actually remarkably influential. Even, of course, now today, the only thing you ever hear about that is evil Joe, that evil drunk Wisconsin Republican Joe McCarthy and all the terrible things he did. No one ever knows. No political science student is ever told that we now know there actually were communists in the State Department. Alger Hiss really was a communist. And so sometimes when people say the sky is falling, it does behoove one to look up and see if there might be something to it. What I'm getting at is this. There is a temptation sometimes to say, oh, well, that's crazy. That's wild. That could never happen. That's too far out. But sometimes the stuff that is out there becomes in here. That is, it doesn't just remain things that they do in Europe, crazy ideas that those crazy Europeans, who knows what they'll do, or those Canadians, they're up to all kinds of funny business. But sometimes those ideas take root in the United States and actually affect our ability to say things that we believe, even if they're unpopular. And in other words, all this could actually, and perhaps is already actually, having an effect on the ability of Americans to speak freely.
No, you're right. Truth is often stranger than fiction, and that seems to be, the case right now with people kind of putting their heads in the sand. A lot of folks are starting to get their heads out of the sand, but I fear just as many are heading in that direction, because you don't want to, just the idea of losing what we've had for so long is just too hard for a lot of us to wrap our minds around. But in order to take it back, we have to try to understand, and here's where I think it's key. I think it's key that we understand the methods and the processes of how these things happen. I think that's even more important than taking on these myriad issues. In fact, a lot of times these issues become distractions if you don't understand what's going on in the background, the methods and the processes that are used to dupe people. We can go on and on about Obamacare, immigration, the LGBT thing, the trade, foreign policy. But what's really happening, I think, and I think this is really important, is that one side, the side that treasures and appreciates freedom for everybody, inherent freedom of speech, association, religion, to write what you want to write. Those of us who appreciate that seem to be grossly unaware of the methods and processes of social psychology and depth psychology that are being used to turn people around. Let me just add one more fact to that. One of the things that Ms. Powers, Kirsten Powers, who wrote The Silencing, mentions in her book, is that there's a bias in social psychology against conservatives or Republicans. In fact, one fairly liberal social psychologist who's calling for diversity in social psychology, saying he's amazed that there's just like none who will identify themselves, if there are any, who are conservative social psychologists, people who study all of these effects of mass psychology, how people behave in crowds, how people are influenced, how the cult mindset can take root. People who understand all of that stuff. There are very few, if any, Republicans or conservatives or just realists studying and looking at that, and certainly none who are policy advisors to those who you would think would respect and appreciate the First Amendment rights. So I think that's part of the problem of how we got here. And, you know, I could write, I got a whole bunch of articles I feel I need to write about these things because I think that's so key, that our side seems to have dropped the ball on understanding how political correctness really works, to create that fear of isolation, that fear of rejection in a human being so that they'll keep their mouths shut. And that, of course, will, it has, a domino effect, and it'll cause others to keep their mouths shut as they fear they're the only ones who believe something. And that separates all of us. That creates a polarization and separation in society that's just so damaging to human freedom and not just freedom of expression, but just, it damages the potential for friendship, for true community, for, anything that's really good. And unfortunately, there's this force that is working to separate us, and there is this. There are elites that absolutely put into practice these methods and processes to kind of develop this cult mindset.
You're talking about an intentional move, an intentional philosophy, an intentional program to fragment people and to set them against each other socially, not personally, but socially and ideologically. I think, and when I say that, an intentional movement and all of that, what I'm trying to say here is that certain elites that have power agendas, and many and most elites seem to have power agendas. I think we all know that. That's a human failing, a human kind of emanates from pride. But there are just so many signals and signs out there. The silencing of any other train of thought, any other idea on agenda items that are being pushed really, really hard right now, especially this gender identity thing. The fact that debate is not even on the table. I mean, if you followed what happened at Fairfax County Public Schools, I think it was 2 weeks ago, where the school board voted something like 9-1 in favor of this gender identity thing that will, they call it the bathroom bill and all of that, but they voted in favor of it because they had a huge amount of pressure put on by the Obama administration to pass this thing. Otherwise, they're going to get the federal funding pulled. But it was amazing because apparently I wasn't there, but the auditorium was just packed beyond capacity. I mean, there were people outside who came to protest this, parents and
I think, I don't know if there were teachers there, but there were, parents, citizens, said, what's going on? This, we haven't even talked about this. And they pushed for it anyway. And, of course, the problem for the folks pushing these agendas is you cannot allow people to talk these things through, or they can't get through. There's like this window of opportunity. So the issue of social psychology and manipulating human beings' fear of social isolation and rejection, it's an ancient tactic. I mean, we know it as divide and conquer, but through various forms of mockery, labeling, calling people a flat earther or a bigot, or all of these little techniques and methods. Yes, they've been used in a very organized fashion to shut down debate. Absolutely.
This is part one of a two-part episode of our discussion with Stella Morabito about the LGBT movement and political correctness and the attempt to silence dissent.
Tune in next week.
Join us next time for part two of our discussion with Stella Morabito.
Good night, Chet. And from Washington, thank you, and good night for all of us at NBC News.
Subscribe at heidelblog.net in iTunes or your podcast app. Write to Heidelcast at heidelblog.net or on Twitter at @RScottClark. Send us a message and we may use it in a future broadcast. Remember, the Heidelcast may be cheap, but it isn't free. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth triples.
Copyright 2015, all rights reserved.
Adjusting the Wayback Machine, Sherman and I were quickly on our way.
Spotlighting next, Johnny Holiday. For your entertainment, he's about to get underway. Sit back and just listen, listen. Be sure to listen every day to Johnny Holiday.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome into the Johnny Holiday Glass Cage with the old refugee from the Sunshine State to serve up